Welcome to Confessions of a Cyberpsychologist. I am Carolyn Freeman, and today I am chatting with Dr. Scott Debb about leveraging cyberpsychology to navigate life in the digital age. Scott is a cyberpsychology researcher and professor of psychology, a licensed professional counsellor, a Quality-of-Life Questionnaire translation report writer, and also a consultant working with individuals and businesses in education, research, and supervisory consulting. Welcome, Scott. I'm so delighted to have you on board.
Hi, thank you for that very flattering introduction.
Scott, before we get chatting about the work and research you do, can you tell me a little bit more about who you are, what you do, kind of, and what the pivot point was that sent you down the road of cyberpsychology?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a professor of psychology, Norfolk State. I've been there probably, I don't know, about at least 10, 12 years now. I'm also a licensed professional counselor, which it depends on what jurisdiction you're in, what country you're in, of what that entails. In the U.S., that is basically you're doing therapy. You are, working with people who have various types of mental health issues, and so just kind of a traditional outpatient therapy. But it's licensed state by state here in the United States, and there's overarching, kind of governing boards, just like the APA or the BPS, kind of the same thing. So my main job is at the university, and I teach graduate. At this point, I'm teaching just graduate courses in the Masters of Science Cyberpsychology program, as well as mentoring students on their capstone research projects. So, and then I also do consulting work related to cyberpsychology, related to quality of life, translation of questionnaires, which we can talk more about later. And the other question that you had at the start here was, how did I kind of fall down the rabbit hole of cyberpsychology? So when I first started at Norfolk State, again, I'm probably almost 12 years ago at this point, first year, university, the newbie in the department. So just, one day just sitting in my office, might have been office hours actually, and someone from the computer science department comes walking through the psychology department, just asking people if they wanted to be part of an interdisciplinary grant project that he was putting together. And this is a computer science guy who's worked in industry for decades, Bell Labs in New Jersey. So he's he knows how to write up, grant proposals in a really unique way. And he's gotten millions and millions of dollars of government funding here in the U.S. And he's just walking around the office asking people, I just need 2 pages, I need a social science person on this project. It's interdisciplinary. I just need you to write up 2 pages. And, as the new guy, you don't want to say anything. You don't want to kind of jump in front of anyone. And he makes his way around to every office. Everyone's too busy. Some people are like, I don't know anything about computer science. And he's like, it's not computer science, it's cybersecurity, it is, it's just interdisciplinary. And he's like, you don't need to be technical. I just need a social science person. Everyone basically said no, they had other stuff to do. And, I kind of sneaked up my hand. I'm like, 2 pages, I can, what do you need in these 2 pages? And it was something fairly generic, definitely not cyberpsychology at this point. So wrote it up. About 2 years later, this is through the Air Force Research Lab and the Department of Defense, pre-COVID. And, so it's a little bit of a different world at this point here in the U.S. But back then, about 2 years after that, proposal was submitted, we got funded. And it was 5 years, $5 million for this capacity building project for minority serving institutions in the U.S. to train the next generation of high-tech government workforce. So primarily focused on cybersecurity, computer science people, but there was this interdisciplinary component of the project. And about a year or so sitting in on all these meetings that were very technical and talking about, creating server racks for VM test beds and doing all this type of different, penetration testing and all these different terms with, with servers and switches that I've never really known, like what they actually represented in real world application. About a year in, I said, well, I was looking around and I found that, human aspects of cybersecurity seem to be pretty important. And there's no part of this project that really touches on that. So I found this thing called cyberpsychology. It's kind of big in Europe, not really a well-known term here in the US. What if we go down that road? And a lot of things happened, over the next couple of years. That 5-year, $5 million turned into 7-year, $7 million. And with that, I was able to get funding to bring a couple of people to the U.S. to speak at Norfolk State that were established in the cyberpsychology world. And one person was from Australia, one was from Ireland, and they came over to the university. I was able to get some funding to go over to Wolverhampton. That was my first cyberpsychology conference, and happened to sit down for dinner next to some random person I didn't know, but it turned out to be Brenda Wiederhold, and so that was a good connection to make. And and then I think it was 2018, we were able to get officially approved for the Master of Science in Cyberpsychology program, which was the first master's program in the U.S. in cyberpsych. There was an established undergrad program in New Jersey, but this was the first Masters of Science program. So, that's kind of the long version of how I got there.
That's very exciting, being a pioneer in a pioneering field.
Yeah, never in my wildest dreams would I foresee being part of bringing cyberpsychology to, let alone a whole university, but really becoming just part of an international community. Not something I necessarily set out to do, but being that it's going on the back half of 10 years at this point, I can't imagine having not been involved in this community, and it's really been rewarding on an academic level, research level, and just with the friendships I made along the way.
I chatted a few podcast episodes ago to Louisa Dare,
Yep.
who mentioned a current research project working on around polarisation of political beliefs around social media. Can you talk a bit more about this and kind of what kind of insights you've gathered so far?
Yeah, so this is kind of the latest research study that I'm kind of brought my lab team into last semester, maybe the beginning of 2025, when we first put in for IRB approval for the project. So essentially, there's a lot going on in the U.S. right now, and it's kind of upside down and inside out and pretty crazy, and very hard to keep up with things day to day. It's just extremely exhausting and stressful. And there's a couple of things that I've kind of done in my own personal life to try to manage some of that stress. And, some of it is getting involved with, kind of local organizations to, kind of be our own voice, to let kind of others know that their voice is not alone, and not to be afraid to speak up for what they believe is, kind of moral and ethical and things like that. And I figured that I don't think it was a day in particular, but kind of a series of days where I decided that it was something worth researching. And being that a lot of the research that we've done in the lab is kind of social media based, looking at fear of missing out and attitudes and behaviors, the gap between attitudes and behaviors in different online contexts, it seemed like this was a direct extension of some of that. And so we've collected some preliminary data at this point, not hundreds and hundreds of people, but we're hopefully on our way to that. So, we're collecting data through the end of the year, basically. And in Australia, in Sydney, over the over July, I presented on some very preliminary data. And what we're specifically trying to look at is Gen Z, African American, as compared to college, Caucasian college counterparts in this area, which is in Virginia, the southeastern portion of Virginia. Norfolk State's a historically black college, so minority serving institution. We have a kind of a sisterish kind of school like about a mile away that's a much bigger 30,000 student population that's pretty diverse, so collecting data from both universities. And essentially what we're starting off looking at is just to kind of get a gauge as a baseline of what their political perspectives are. So part of it is asking, if they kind of lean left or lean right with things. And then to start asking some questions about their experience with misinformation or disinformation, malinformation. How do you spot, or what's your decision-making process regarding differentiating, fake news, for example, or, what they would define as fake news, looking to see if there's differences in how polarized they see the U.S. right now. And this is a really big thing. It's really huge because not everyone in the U.S. goes and votes, even though we have this, this longed for right to do so. And in many contexts, there's a misnomer about this, that people are not invested, or they don't care, or they've, checked out on some of it. And the reality that we're hoping to, one of our hypotheses is that may not actually be the full story. For example, if you have a minority serving, institution, then the students who are there, by and large, are coming from a very different cultural perspective. And if we can essentially survey students, get their perspectives through different questions that are not just valid, face valid, we'll better understand what their motivation for or not, to do things or not to do things, such as voting or be politically active, or even care necessarily, specifically because non-white people in the U.S. have kind of suffered through systemic racism for decades. And they've already, speaking kind of in broad generalities, they've already gone through a lot of what white people now are starting to feel firsthand. And so one of our hypotheses is that there might be that political disengagement and a lack of political engagement, or, through voting, for example, because they've already been through this fight and they haven't received the support as a whole. One racial group, has not received the support from the majority racial group in the U.S. So that's one of our hypotheses to work through, is that may be part of the reason. And then on top of that, we're also trying to look at specifically the Gen Z component to see what their beliefs are regarding polarization, how severe it is, if things are polarized. Our wording is trying, the wording we've used in our questions is very particular to not be biased or leading. So we're trying to ask people, if you do see bias, if you do see polarization, where is it coming from? Who's more receptive to changing? Someone who's more conservative, someone who's more liberal, someone who's more Democratic, someone who's more Republican. So we're trying to assess as a baseline how their views on things are. And then some of the other questionnaires that we've included in this big survey battery are, kind of the more, more psychological ones in nature, looking at fear of missing out, need to belong, resilience, quality of life, things like that. And hopefully when we collect enough data, we'll be able to really start to see a bigger picture not just assuming the end result of what someone's perspective is, but like I mentioned before, the gap between what people say and what they do. See if we can fill in some of the blanks with some of these variables that we're collecting data from.
That's really fascinating because my bias is that younger generations are politically disengaged and they just don't really care enough. Or they're just going, well, that's for all people.
Right.
And also part of the bias, and I think this comes from the Brexit voters, that a lot of the older generation vote. And they're the ones who sway things more than the younger generation. So that'll be a really interesting insight into how younger people see political engagement and whether or not it's actually doing anything for them and how polarized it actually is.
Yeah. Yeah, we want to try to give, we want to try to hear their voice and then be able to kind of digest that voice through the data and our analyses, and then whether it's through presentations or at conferences, or if we can get our some things published, putting that voice back out there, because in psychology literature in general, and it's better than it was, but in general, at least from a US perspective, there's not a lot of studies that focus on comparison between, let's say, black and white. It's, sometimes it's oversampling, non-majority individuals. And sometimes there's kind of there seems like maybe there's an attempt to include non-white people in the study. But, it's one of the things I've heard over the years is, the sample is representative based on, U.S. Census data, which, when you're trying to really understand a whole community's voice, or even a whole culture's voice, you can't just go by that. So our effort, because we have the student population right on hand, is very purposely to oversample African American, and then to have a comparison to the white students as their counterparts. And these are non-clinical samples. These are just convenient samples of students who are at these two institutions. So one of the things that we can be a little bit more confident about is not having to account for too much of any kind of serious mental illness, although we have some screeners in our survey battery to identify if someone has like very heightened anxiety or they're experiencing more depressive symptoms, so we can control for some of that as well.
That's a good point. You spoke earlier about research being kind of fitting in with the demographics of the population.
Mm-hmm.
But if you've only got 1% of the population in a certain group, that's not really going to get their voice heard. So having that kind of equal representation of a specific group is fundamental for getting a good understanding of how the groups think and giving each group a representative voice in the debates.
Yeah, and some of our previous research that we've done in the lab with, I've had a couple of doctoral students in my lab, a handful or more of our master's students from the program, the Cyberpsych program, and a couple of undergrads that are high achieving undergrads as well that we brought into the lab so far. And in the past couple of years, we've been fortunate enough to get some publications and presentations at conferences that look at essentially validating or trying to ensure, that there's that the questionnaires that are kind of in the literature are valid for use with not just kind of the generic kind of white middle-aged sample, and so we've looked at the FOMO questionnaire. We've looked at an online kind of cybersecurity attitudes and belief questionnaire. We've looked at social media usage screeners, a couple of other things. And our purpose, because these were already established measures, was really to look at essentially some version of invariance testing to see if these questionnaires can be used effectively and accurately for different populations, in particular black and white. And so as we've gone along, what we've been able to do, at least with this part, is if someone's going to include some of these questionnaires in their research, they can do so confidently that that there are any differences that they see in their results, any outcomes that they're seeing that are significant, are not due to the measure being faulty or not being able to measure the intended, constructs. So that's kind of helped us over the last couple of years. And so, for example, in this, the data collection that we're doing now for political polarization, we have this FOMO questionnaire that we've already tested, we've already revised. We've been able to kind of lower the number of questions and ensure the combination of questions is optimal for comparing, for including African Americans in the study. So those are the types of things that we're kind of focusing on in the lab, which I feel brings a very unique component to the cyberpsychology world. Our kind of small but very significant international community, because there hasn't been a lot of focus in the cyberpsych world because it is so diverse. We're coming from so many different countries and cultures, and what's a minority in the U.S. and what's a majority and a minority group in the U.S. is different across all these different countries and parts of the world. So I feel like this is what our unique contribution can be, and hopefully will be for a while.
So in terms of your lab, are there any other research projects that you're currently involved in? And how do they kind of align with your research speciality that you have within your lab?
Yeah, so like I was mentioning a little bit before, we focused on kind of different aspects of social media in the sense of the purpose of why people are using social media, because that seems to be very different across not just international cultures, but across kind of age cohorts. I have an undergraduate student right now who's interested in looking at people's kind of a second Instagram. They call it a Finsta, fake Instagram account, and understanding why people are more apt to be very kind of personal and disclose things that in their main account they don't. It's more of a kind of a high level overview of their life. So that's one aspect of things that we've looked at in the past, but now even more focused with the student wanting to do this kind of research, which is great. There's the social media, the purpose of social media component of things, the fear of missing out part. Earlier, as when we were still part of the grant is already over, the 7-year project is over at this point for a couple of years. But when we were doing that, it was very heavily aligned with cybersecurity because that was the nature of that grant project. So one of the things we started off doing was looking at, again, like the difference between attitudes and behaviors with cybersecurity best practices. And so we are right now, we're finishing up, we're halfway through on the back end of finishing up a validation study where we collected several hundred people, given this long questionnaire, 75 question questionnaire that was developed by other people, I think about 2013, 14, something like that. So that's a validation questionnaire where we're looking for the difference between applicability for Caucasian and white African American in the U.S. So we're analyzing the data for that one. We've done the same thing for a fear of missing out questionnaire. It was a 10-item questionnaire that we did the same exact process for, and we are finishing up. We already presented on this at a couple of different conferences, and so now we are probably about 75% writing up our manuscript, which we hope to submit hopefully by the end of this month. And then the political polarization study really has just gotten started. Again, we've done some work with the preliminary data, but moving forward, I mean, there's so much more that we haven't even scratched the surface with. So one of the students in the lab, I don't even know if it's fair to say he's a student because he graduated in December, just like Louise. that you interviewed recently, Louise graduated last December as well. So they both, her and Frank, Gilbert is his name. They both graduated in December and still being really helpful and productive in the lab, just because it's interesting, to them, and they're a part of things. And Frank in particular has an interest in the political polarization aspect of things. So we should be able to really dig into things, in the future. But that's kind of the major things that we're working on. And I think there's a ton of other things that we're interested in that we've kind of written, like small little, I've had some students kind of do some lit reviews just so we have a basis if we can move forward, if we had more bandwidth. So right now there's a whole bunch of different things that are just kind of laying around that if we figure out if there's a student who's interested for a capstone and something aligns, we have a good jumping off point. But yeah, those are the major thing right now is finishing up the fear of missing out stuff and moving into the political polarization stuff.
This is the tough side of cyberpsychology. There's so many interesting things to study.
Yeah.
And as you say, there's just not enough researchers
Yeah.
and so much that needs to be done and so
Mhm.
many interesting things. So it's kind of like picking low-hanging fruit if you want to do a capstone project or
Mhm.
masters or anything. It's just so
Mhm.
easy to pick something that's really interesting.
Yeah, and like any
Yeah.
other graduate student, whether they're master's or doctoral level, part of the hard part, and I guess it's for me as well, the hard part is not biting off too much that you can chew and realizing that
Yes.
you, you have this like really interesting like fear of missing out. There could be 1,000 different things, to look
Yeah.
at with that. And it's really about trying to narrow it down so that we can manage in a reasonable time frame. But that's all of social science research.
Exactly. Yeah, because this is exactly the issue I had in my PhD. I've got like 10 questions, 10 research questions. I want to answer
Yeah.
all of these. And they're like, no, just pick one.
Yeah.
Oh, no, please, can I do all of them?
Yep. Yeah, exactly. And it's so difficult,
So
especially when students
fascinating.
come in and they're like really gung ho about it. And it's, and my first reaction to it is, yeah, let's just do everything. And then I got to, bring that back for myself and the student, but
Yeah.
they have the right idea. And that's what I like, they want to examine these big picture types of things. And it's really hard to realize that you just can't do it with one study. You can't dump everything into one study. It becomes too much to manage. It becomes too burdensome for the people that you're asking to participate. And so there's that disappointment factor. But then once you
Yeah.
start getting into it and the data starts coming in, then the excitement kind of comes, flying back in and usually hits you right on the side of the head and says, like, let's do this.
And talking about exciting projects, you're in the process of writing a book with Dr. Andrew Campbell, who's based in Sydney University. Can you tell us a bit more about this book and kind of when you project it being available?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is not like part of the lab. I'll say that, kind of adjacent to it. And a couple of months ago, Wiley Publishers had reached out to me, it was surprising to me. I did, and they said, we looked at one of the associate editors had reached out and said, we've looked at some of your publications. And I guess the combination of what we were looking at and then combining it with the cultural component that I mentioned earlier, they said, we'd like you to put in a proposal for a textbook, as opposed to us, randomly doing it. So I, having done this, put together a proposal. I had another professor here at Norfolk State, who we brought on recently, Dr. Stacy Thayer. I asked her if she'd like to be a co-author. And then I reached out to Dr. Andrew Campbell, just, based on my relationship with him, knowing him since probably the Cyberpsychology conference when we held it on campus here in Norfolk State. I think that was right before the pandemic. So we had so just getting to know him, just kind of going out to dinner with some of the folks afterwards. kind of just impromptu, kind of let's just go out to dinner kind of thing, and getting to talk with him, kind of establishing that relationship, knowing that he would, both him and Dr. Thayer would be kind of reliable co-authors that bring something unique to the lineup. So I asked them to be the co-authors. We went through a couple of rounds of things with the proposal with Wiley. And then just recently, their editorial board approved everything, and we signed the contract a couple of weeks ago. So, yeah, we're extremely excited, but also extremely when are we going to find time for all this? Obviously, labor of love type of thing. So we intended to be kind of an intro to cyber psych kind of textbook for either kind of individual chapters being applicable to upper level undergraduates, but primarily being relevant for introduction to cyberpsych type of courses at the master's level. So kind of like a 500 level course here in the US. And having very diverse perspectives on our authorship team, especially with Andrew being, international compared to us being in the US. Our goal is to infuse what Wiley was really hoping we would put into the proposal, which is what we did, which I think differentiates us from some of the other cyberpsych textbooks, is having this real big emphasis on the cross-cultural component, as well as focusing not necessarily on the specific digital technologies right now, because those are just coming so fast and furious, and they'll, by the time the textbook gets published, half of them become obsolete. So not necessarily saying, just Instagram or just TikTok, but the lessons that we learn from the purpose of what people use it for, like I was mentioning before, and even being able to incorporate kind of these, our goal is to have these threads that will transcend a specific time frame, that will apply 5 years from now, 5 generations of digital technology from now, with the kind of the cross-cultural component, and even bringing in some of the political polarization stuff, not as a standalone chapter, but weaved into the book, because of how how it's so rooted in social media over the last at least 10, if not 20 years. And so that's what I think our textbook will bring, which I hope appeals to people. And so, yeah, so the textbook, basically 2025, the rest of this year, and 2026, towards probably like October 2026 is when we're hoping to be done with everything. And Wiley's hoping to get it published in print and as an e-text, obviously, to go live in January for semesters that will start January of 2027.
You answered one of my questions about why it's different from other cyberpsychology textbooks, because there's quite a lot out there. I won't say a lot. There's
There's a
already
handful, yeah.
quite a few.
Mhm.
The other thing I was thinking, though, is because I've had a couple of conversations with people and been reading a bit about the Eastern versus Western style of
Mhm.
how you engage with technology. So the individualistic approach versus the community approach
Mhm.
to engaging with digital technology. Are you incorporating that into your book, or is it just going to be from as an individual Western culture, or a community-based, the rest of the world culture?
To the best extent possible, our goal is to incorporate different perspectives.
Okay.
Not just simply saying, very purposefully not limiting ourselves to a kind of white Eurocentric perspective. Based on our authorship team, that's that's where we need to employ our psychology training in particular to manage our biases, to be aware of what we're writing, how we're writing it, the sources that we're pulling from. And one of the ways that I've envisioned helping to provide a check and balance on some of that is with the different people who might add kind of small but significant contributions. That, they're not listed as co-authors, but they will be listed in the book as having a significant contribution, and they'll be listed by name. My goal is to try to employ in that process, whether they're current master's cyberpsychology students or recent graduates of cyberpsychology, certainly at NSU here, but also at University of Sydney and other universities where we have so many contacts that are across the world in this, kind of cyberpsychology world. My goal is to reach out to, once we start getting a little closer to drafting things, to reach out, combine between the three of us, our international networks of people, and getting their perspective, not necessarily just relying on Wiley to send things out to people, which that's great, don't get me wrong, but our own internal, networks of people that we know, especially that we know personally, that we've been to these international conferences over the last, 10 years or so. We all have these well-established, again, not just networks on LinkedIn or something like that. These are people we've actually met face to face, and we've had dinner with them, and we've gotten to know them, professionally, but more than just, from a distance. And being able to reach out to these folks and ask them, hey, can you take a look at this, section or chapter that we've written and give us some feedback from your perspective, where you're from, non-US, non-Australia, even non-Europe, areas. And, does this make sense from where you're coming from? And that's probably the biggest way that we hope to provide some checks and balances on ourselves.
And I think that's really vital to make it so different and so applicable
Hmm.
beyond just, as you say, kind of Western, European, Western, Caucasian
Hmm.
kind of perspectives, which a lot of the cyber psych seems to be written from at this
Yeah, and
point.
it's not inherently like I don't think anyone ever sets out to, to underrepresent anyone.
No, not at
And
all.
so we're just kind of learning the lessons from what other people have done. We're not trying to reinvent the entire wheel, just a little piece of it. And by bringing in, some of these other views in particular, but still in a digestible, and the textbook, we really want it to be more conversational. So it's still
Yeah.
academic. It'll still have, references and everything in it. And it's obviously written by, or will be written by three, established, kind of academics in the cyber psychology field. But the goal is to have it as a conversational tone to really apply, and be digestible to students, in general, younger students, that right now they're Gen Z students, but again, with that thread that transcends a specific time frame. So, again, like we're not trying to reinvent all of cyber psychology, but we want to be able to infuse as much kind of intro to psychology, almost like an undergrad, into the textbook, to be able to weave the different chapters together so that there's a logical connection that, does our best to identify blind spots, that,
Yeah.
maybe people have, not even, well, blind spot, people have not necessarily been aware of before, but there is more awareness now. There are more books, regular books being published, not just textbooks, but, from academics who are writing things, whether it's cyberpsych community in specific, or even, people who are writing in kind of the tech and economics world, where they're bringing in, issues about, whether it's, social media companies and platforms, or kind of, the big tech giants of the world, and what, influence they have. And this affects people all over, right? I mean, it's, operating and doing things online and connectivity online. There might be different apps across the world to facilitate this, but they're all operating in the same kind of, way in the background. I mean, the name of the platform might be different. The algorithm might be, proprietary in different ways, but the impact that it has, like that's the thread that we want to bring through across cultures.
I want to chat a bit about your therapy side or licensed
Hmm.
professional counselor side of what you do.
Yeah.
Um, so you work in Virginia and you work with individuals, couples, and families. So what is the kind of psychotherapy work that you get most involved in?
Yeah. So my background, my graduate training is Adlerian psychology. I went to I'm from New York, but I moved to Chicago for graduate school. And aside from all the comments of my friends back in New York, I'm from Brooklyn, about how bad the pizza in Chicago is, because there's a whole rivalry here about New York versus Chicago pizza. For the record, New York pizza is the best. Um, so, aside from that, like why am I going to Chicago kind of thing? I did move there to go to the Adler School of Psychology, which is now Adler University. They have a satellite campus in Vancouver. They had some Sunday classes kind of thing, like weekend classes back. I mean, it's going back a couple of decades here, where people would fly in for the weekend from, like Toronto and things like that, because it's, not too far of a flight from, from Chicago kind of thing. And some people would drive in, just kind of go through, go through Michigan. But point being was, it was all kind of Adlerian psychology, individual psychology, Alfred Adler. And Adler, so that's my therapeutic focus. I start at that place, and Adlerian, I mean, there's a whole bunch of pieces to it, but one of the most important thing is where you feel and how you feel your social place is. And, so from a mental health standpoint, if you feel like you have no place or you feel like you're helpless, maybe those are symptoms of anxiety or depression. Just as an example, or when I'm working with couples in particular, one person doesn't feel like they have, kind of equal standing, equal not meaning 50-50, but, both people being seen and, feeling like they're both equal partners. And so that goes right back to Adlerian life tasks. How do you manage relationships, and how do you manage intimate relationships, and how do you see yourself functioning in the work environment? A lot of people. What I've seen a lot is I specialize a little bit more with men's issues. I have some female clients as well, but majority are men, and sometimes they come in the couples work, and sometimes it's individual. But a lot of times it's men who feel like they only are able to identify with the work that they do, or the job that they have, or the income that they can bring. And, there's like a cultural, not a stereotype, but there's this cultural component, at least it might be changing a little bit now, over the last couple of, decade or three. But men very much see themselves as providers. And if they don't need to provide as much because women are, just as capable, if not a lot more capable in the workforce, they lose their sense of identity. And I think one of the things that's happened over the last, at least in the US, I can't speak for the entire world here, but, over the last couple of decades, is that women have worked to improve themselves, personal growth wise. And men have not done so at the same level, with the same, veracity. And so they feel left behind because they've left themselves behind. And working with, whether it's in a couple's situation or individually with men, to empower them to see themselves as being more than just, this one individual piece, right? This is what we were taught in the Adlerian world also, is the whole is greater than the sum of the parts. But a lot of men don't see that. They see just this one component, this one perspective of themselves as this provider, something like that. Not all men, obviously, but enough that it's problematic. And then they bring those stressors and anxieties and fears, they mask those things a lot of times, and they bring those into their relationship, into their marriage, and it becomes destructive. And sometimes, a lot of times it's kind of this toxic masculinity or gaslighting. And then the more that I talk with the guy, in particular, you can see that a lot of it has to do with insecurity. And for men, it's very difficult to express insecurity, let alone admit it. But working with another male therapist who I hope I provide a very, kind of safe and non-judgmental place where they can talk about their vices, talk about their feelings, where, they can talk about stressors, and what I like to do is try to help them reinterpret, like stress is not an emotion, right? If you feel stressed, you might actually be thinking that you're stressed. So trying to reconnect the emotion for them with like, what's the real emotion? What are you really worried about? What is it? And a lot of times it's some insecurity about being insignificant or not needed on some level. Anyway, so this is very much this Adlerian approach. So what's your place? What's your social place at work, at home, with family? And I kind of incidentally, that's the whole thing with social media too, right? It's a community feeling. And so one of the things I'm interested in that's kind of on my longer list of things to see if I can incorporate into my research is, which other people have looked at it as well, in different ways, is social media bringing people closer together or further apart? And it's not a simple answer. It's not as straightforward as a lot of people think it is. Having online friendships doesn't mean you're distant, but it certainly could in certain situations. So pulling that apart, and then the big thing for me that's really interesting, which is a whole nother animal to tackle, is how the companies that own these platforms, how their business model, how their for-profit business model impacts the idea of what connectivity is. And, again, stemming from this Adlerian kind of background, it's easier for me to see this picture of how being socially connected and socially embedded, which are these Adlerian things, how that's being mediated, moderated, not just by social media as this like, kind of amoeba type of thing, but really by the platforms themselves. And the platforms are owned by companies that have a for-profit model, which is not necessarily in anyone's best interest, except for, the profit part of things. And so there's a lot of kind of manipulative practices that wind up shaping people's behavior and how they learn about things. It's just, again, like infusing the intro to psych stuff, right? That's the learning chapter. It's like chapter 5 in every intro to psych textbook or something like that. And so these are all, shaping and learning and how, how you're influenced. And so all this stuff is part of what I'm interested in looking at. How does an algorithm or algorithms operating in the background of social media, which that's the engine for all of it, right? How does that influence how people not just learn about things, but how do they see things, and how does that keep them connected or make them less connected, which kind of is a direct line to the political or cultural polarization, especially in the US, that I can observe firsthand. It's the political stuff is one part of it, but the cultural part is a whole nother one, where a lot of these, in my opinion, policy decisions that are happening recently are not just, they exist on different levels. And I think this is my opinion, not based on like a textbook or an article I can point to, but hopefully our research can speak to it a little bit. There's a lot of it that is racist and misogynistic operating in the background. And so another one of my hypotheses or research questions here is hopefully to be able to expose what people's perspectives are about this, to see if there's that alignment. So anyway, point being is the Adlerian stuff just happens to be a through line to the polarization stuff that I'm interested in right now.
And there's also the kind of question of therapy bots in terms of how they shape the way we see socialness and connectedness and our place in the world. Because Mark Zuckerberg, I think, said something about he wants everyone to have a companion bot,
Mhm.
which to me sounds frightening,
Yeah.
and just so kind of bottom line, profit driven
Yeah.
perspective rather than. And I like what you said in terms of their perspective of social connectedness is so different from a historical perspective of what
Mhm.
social connectedness means. And I wonder if that things like therapy bots or relationship bots are taking it to a whole different level of perspective.
Yeah. So, again, one of the questions to ask as a baseline, even for not just, not as a researcher, but even just as a parent, for example, with a kid who might be, or a teenager who might be kind of seeking, some validation, at the very least from, let's say, kind of mental health oriented app or chatbot. The first thing to really look at is who developed this thing. Is it someone with expertise in psychology or background in psychology, expertise in clinical psychology, right? Typically not. It might be occasionally. Is this chatbot created by a big tech company where they're just looking for engagement? That might be an ethical, kind of quandary that the big tech company doesn't care about, but we in the field would. So again, is it about engagement? Is it about connecting someone with, here's the chatbot, and the chatbot says, sounds like you're feeling really disconnected right now. Here's a good YouTube channel to go check out that might make you feel more connected. Like, that seems shady, right? I mean, even at face value, it might be like, oh, they're connecting me with resources. Are these resources valid? Are they going to do more harm than good? And then people have talked about what this can look like, with the chatbots, the pros and the cons. There are pros, but there are a lot of cons. And I think that, there's a lot of research out there, enough research to kind of make an informed decision or start learning about some of the patterns of the good and the bad. The thing that I'm really interested in, just kind of stemming from the big tech stuff I was mentioning before, is kind of the patchwork of legal things, legal oversight, especially in between different countries, where, what mechanism of oversight is there? Is there something on a local level, on a, statewide or national level or international level? It seems like there's a huge patchwork. So if someone's interacting with a chatbot, or even like generative AI, where it seems like there's there's a lot of stuff in the news recently about how people are engaging with whatever, generative AI platform that they choose. These are not real people, right? This is, a kind of some semblance of a personality that the programmers have given to it. And this kind of goes back to this idea of like uncanny valley, like what becomes a little too creepy in terms of a piece of digital technology operating with some semblance of consciousness or humanity, which we're probably decades, if not more, away from any type of like cyber consciousness. I mean, the term exists in the literature, but not from the perspective of, will AI take over the world? I think we're kind of a ways away from that right now. It's still based on human beings, as the operators, putting prompts in. So will AI give someone the formula to blow up the world? Maybe, but that's different than AI blowing up the world because it's taken over. So, so the thing that, to go back to what I'm really focused on in terms of, my angle on it is who's the overseeing, who's overseeing the moral and ethical aspects to something like a therapy chatbot. Where are the checks and balances? If someone's interacting and it makes it worse, and they, they're depressed and they don't get what they need and they decide, to commit suicide, who's responsible for that? Is there any realism to the idea that a big tech company that one of those 3 or 4 big tech companies of the world are going to get sued and lose, not unless it's some gigantic class action lawsuit. And like, I don't see anything like that in any foreseeable future here where that becomes, uh, real. So where's the oversight? Where's the quality control? That's what I'm concerned about, above and beyond like the pros and the cons.
Okay, so Scott, you are a report writer for Quality-of-Life Questionnaire translation. What kind of does that work involve?
Yeah, so for the last, oh man, I don't know, 20 about almost 20 years, I've been involved with a company. Their name is Facit, F-A-C-I-T, and they do quality of life translation. So quality of life questionnaires, we translate them into, you pick a language around the world. We've translated a questionnaire or several into that language. And essentially what they're doing is it's what's called translation science. Translation in the sense of like literal, like linguistic translation. And the process, I mean, it's a fairly, robust process of doing this kind of mostly qualitative work. There's these established questionnaires, and whether it's a research study from a university or a drug company that's trying to bring a drug to market, they will, they need to show outcomes, clinical outcomes. And so we have these questionnaires that have well established since probably the 90s in terms of their English, translation and applicability. And so we do these cross-cultural, international, again, pick a country, pick a language. We've pretty much done them to make sure that the wording of these questionnaires is linguistically and conceptually equivalent across cultures. For example, the word pain in English could be translated, I don't know, 5 different ways in Spanish, depending on what country you're in. So to make sure that the essence of these translations are equivalent. So my part in this whole process is to pull together the different pieces of data from these essentially pilot studies that include a very rigorous translation process with professional translators. And then we do pilot testing with participants in different countries, usually, 5 to 10, sometimes 15 or 20 people. And literally just it's semi-structured interviewing, where they're asked about the translation, what they think the, one or the other words, in the questions are referring to, things like that. And so I pull in the different pieces of data and put it into kind of a technical executive report that whoever the client is, they do whatever they want with it. If it's a pharmaceutical company, a lot of times it'll go into their bigger set of documentation that they submit to the FDA. Same thing if it's, a drug company that's in Europe, and so the company itself is, we all, it's a funny little story. I'll just mention real fast. When I moved to Chicago for graduate school, and then my first daughter was born very soon after that. And, I needed money. I needed a job. I couldn't just be a full-time student at that point, which made life, kind of complex. So I got a temp job, which turned into a full-time job. And it was with this group, which was affiliated with Northwestern University, and still is on some level. But we were within a healthcare system, which was, affiliated with Northwestern University in Evanston, Illinois, which is just north of Chicago. Anyway, so since then I've had this relationship, doing work with them. It's been great. And learning about whether it's the qualitative component of cross-cultural relevance and equivalence. That's been really the main thing that I've taken from that and now apply to the research at the university. So it's been wonderful. I still work with that group to this day. And again, it all started because my daughter was born, and as a temp job for a couple of weeks, and then the person doing the report writing left, and they're like, hey, we need someone. So you never know how things turn out between that, taking a temp job, and then that grant that I was mentioning earlier, where the guy just went around the whole office and asked, anyone interested, and you just kind of raise your hand. Just two disparate pieces that you'd never think, 20 years later in life, build your whole, not just your career, but really give you that excitement to, you're doing something good. You have a small piece in the world. You're not going to affect everyone, but you will affect the people that you have contact with. And it really makes a difference day to day to feel like you're part of things in a positive way. So
the lesson I'm getting from that is if a door opens, walk through it.
Yeah. I've also played hockey for about 30 years, and one of the most famous quotes in the hockey world is from Wayne Gretzky. You can't score. You don't score on 100% of the shots you don't take, right? So, if you never go outside your comfort zone, you might fail, but failure is also motivation to keep going and doing something more and changing the angle on things. And so, you put yourself in some uncomfortable, situations, and you can't score on a shot if you don't take it. So, yeah.
I recently heard this quote, sometimes you lose, no, sometimes you win and sometimes you learn.
Mm-hmm.
And I love that. It's just kind of because we so often fear failure that we don't go for it. But if you see it it's just an opportunity to learn, go for it.
Yeah.
See what happens.
And that's a direct thread to the counseling, the therapy work that you had asked me about earlier. It's the same thing with talking to, again, most of the work I do is with guys who, just anxiety, depression, attention difficulties, substance abuse, that kind of stuff. And a lot of it is, it's just empowering them to not be perfect, and that's okay. And there's kind of an Adlerian term. It's called the courage to be imperfect. And I really try to role model that with the people that I'm doing therapy with. Like, you need a lot of strength and courage to try something, knowing that it may not work out the first time or the 10th time or the 50th time, but that doesn't mean it's not working. That just means you're on your way. And to get, especially guys who feel helpless or hopeless, or they feel really stuck with, what it means to be a guy, realizing that it's not about perfection. Nobody expects you to be perfect. You don't need to expect that of yourself. And in most situations, your spouse doesn't want that either. It's more about just being present and aware, not being perfect. And a lot of times just starting from the wrong premise really, really, over time, it just compounds on people. So, it's really weird to see how all these threads come together in these really weird ways that you would never expect. So.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Scott, if someone who's an individual or business wants to work with you, what's the best way for them to get in touch?
Great. Yeah, I appreciate that question. The best way is you can go, I have a website, Dr. Scott Debb, or drscottdebb.com. There's a contact form there, which will go directly to my email. You can always go on university website, Norfolk State, so nsu.edu/psychology, and just look up my faculty page. My email's there too. So if it's something academic, by all means, use my, go to the faculty webpage. And if it's anything that's otherwise, therapy related or consulting related, I do a lot of, I built the curriculum for the Master's in Science and Cyberpsych program. So that's probably the main thing that I do in terms of consulting is helping with curriculum development, training development, outcomes assessment of those training and curriculum development efforts. So if it's anything related to that, just go to that website, and reach me through there.
And are you actively looking for that kind of work at the moment?
Yeah, definitely. One of the things that I really find very rewarding is incorporating everything that I've learned from not just the cyber psychology. That definitely has a through line though, because it affects everyone in any work environment, in any educational situation. So I bring in the cyber psychology part. A big piece of it, again, is pulling from my graduate training, the Adlerian, kind of your social place, and how you kind of compensate for the things that you feel like you don't have, or that you're not good at. So I bring that into it. And then obviously the clinical work that I've done and the cross-cultural stuff. So I try to bring all those things in specifically depending on what the person I'm, hired by, what their goals are. So I take their goals, bring in these other pieces to to meet those goals. And so I really, I really enjoy doing that because it's separate from any other employer, where there might be, kind of certain boundaries in place, or I have to, I'm kind of meeting someone else's, working within someone else's box kind of thing. Like, university research is great, but there's parameters. Whereas, this is just listen to the person who needs something done, and I can really bring in my training and expertise, and the biggest thing is creativity. Having my own angle on things that I feel is, that I really, I hope other people feel the same way, and I think they do because I get that feedback from people that I'm working with that it is working, it is making a difference, it is meeting their needs, and that's my goal with doing that stuff on my own.
Scott, so what is the most important question I haven't asked you yet?
Yeah, so appreciate you asking that. I think from my particular areas of interest, and obviously this is going to be very different based on who you ask. So the thing that I'm really interested in, it's guided by the political and cultural polarization in the U.S. Just because it's my lived experience, and at this point in my life, you get older, you see things, especially from political perspective, you see it differently. So the thing that I'm really interested in following and being, at least on some level, a part of in terms of the research part of it, which, the speed of digital technology makes it really difficult for research and social science to keep up. The thing that I'm really interested to see how things move forward is, and specifically related to the cyber psychology of it, right? The intersection of the digital technology and human behavior, is what social media becomes. What it is now is different from what it was 20 years ago or 30 years ago, late 90s into the early 2000s. It was something. Over the, mid 2000s to mid, 2010s, late 2010s, it became something different. Then COVID happened, and that just changed the whole nature of doom scrolling and online education. And it has exposed the whole digital divide. It kind of almost renamed that, relabeled what digital divide really meant. Schools that had access and can just jump online versus those who, kids didn't even have a laptop at home. And so COVID changed a whole bunch. And then the last couple of years has really focused on how much algorithms are putting people into echo chambers. And so I'm really, really, really interested on a social science, cyber psychology level, because I don't know the programming side of it, but talking with, computer science colleagues in particular, seeing what social media turns into as the next iteration of it, and what technology on the backdrop of it, and what's that doing, how is that influencing things, what oversight might be put into place, what international pressure might play a role. In Europe, you have things like GDPR, which I realize is not a cure-all for everything, but it's certainly an attempt to demonstrate that privacy is a huge issue. And in the U.S., it's like, what's privacy? And that's something that I do plan to put in my preface in the textbook. Being from Brooklyn and being from New York, I went to undergrad right by the World Trade Center, just a couple of minute walk from there. And, so I was very, intimately affected by that, not just from a distance, but firsthand. And what happened after in the US, what happened after 9/11 very quickly was the Patriot Act. And that was what turned out to be such a huge erosion of privacy in the name of counterterrorism, and what it's turned into since then. And I think this is one of the places where GDPR on the European side became almost like a counterbalance to some of the overreach that was happening in the US from the Patriot Act that was spilling into other countries. So, what happens with further pressure, further privacy efforts? Does that change how social media companies, utilize those algorithms and modify their business model? After Meta kind of became this public thing with Trump, a lot of people dumped Meta. There was this like mass exodus for a little bit of people, closing up shop on their Instagram and Facebook accounts, despite the social part. We saw what happened with Elon Musk after the whole, Doge thing in the US, where Tesla stock just got killed and people were lighting Teslas on fire. And so the way to hit companies is in the pocketbook. How is that going to change the business model, the whole, not the tech industry as a whole, but this social media component, because we know how much it's influencing people?
And then in terms of, because you're writing a textbook and or going to start writing a textbook. So have you got any books that you recommend at this point for others to read before yours is actually launched and the textbook that anyone needs to read in cyberpsychology?
Yeah, absolutely. There's a couple of really good things that are out there. So recently there was a second edition of Granya's book, which I think is a really good intro to cyberpsych textbook for most people, that are in different, classes and courses. So I really like that book. I like the first edition. The second edition is, even more so because they bring a little bit more of the AI stuff into it as well. So I think obviously that's a great book. There's a couple of other things that I've read that are not cyberpsych specific that I think are really good. I don't have the book in front of me, but one of them is, it's called Techno-Feudalism, which I think is a really interesting view of how the 2008 financial crisis that started in the US, how all the bailout money was in some ways directed, or you can say absconded, by these big tech firms, which built up all this digital infrastructure. And the premise of this was I think the finance minister in Greece, former one, is the author. And like his premise of this techno-feudalism is that these big, Google and Amazon, like these big tech firms have essentially become feudal lords, right? The online, cyberspace is now the land, and all these people with, an Amazon storefront, or, the content that you put on, that anyone puts on social media, you're kind of a serf. You're working the land, but you don't own anything. You post your content on social media, on YouTube, it's no longer yours, right? It goes into an algorithm and it gets distributed. You have minimal input you can put hashtags or mention people or create more engaging videos. It could be longer, it could be shorter. So you can do all that. It's tons of work, right? And certain influencers make millions. A lot don't. So you make your millions, but these companies are making billions on your content and you don't own it, right? So people that closed up shop on Facebook, as a reaction or reaction towards not wanting, kind of the metaverse, invading their life, whatever content that they created on those sites, yeah, you can download it and it becomes a zip file, but it's not like you can just upload that zip file onto X or TikTok or wherever, and it's all there. You have to recreate it all. So that's the idea, the techno-feudalism. So it's a really easy read. But in a good way. It's conversational. It tells a really good story. Not everyone agrees with the full premise, but I think that's a good part of any textbook, right? Is to create the discussion about that. There's two other things to mention real fast. There's a book, it's a little bit old at this point. I want to say 2018 or something like that. It's called Algorithms of Oppression. It's a academic researcher at NYU, New York University. And again, this is like pre-pandemic, but her whole premise is really emphasizing that there's bias in the way algorithms work. And a lot of people will say, well, the algorithm is biased. The algorithm is biased, and not quite, right? The algorithm is just a mathematical formula, right? But there's human beings who program these algorithms, that develop the algorithms, the machine learning behind it, whether it's supervised or unsupervised, the training data that goes into it. All that is human based, right? Like even an unsupervised training model, you still have to feed it data. I mean, tons of big data. But where are you sourcing it from, right? If you source it from everything that's online, garbage in, garbage out is possible. So in that Algorithms of Oppression book, she kind of, as a case study kind of example, she lays out how if you were to type in, just in a Google search, especially, 5-6 years ago, you type in black girl or black woman, and it would come up with, like the top search results would be really, kind of almost degrading type of stuff, as opposed to if you typed in like white woman or white, girl, where you get much more kind of like wholesome images of people, everyday people, as opposed to, almost insinuating, a different cultural dynamic that creates a power imbalance or demonstrates it through the Google search results. And the bottom line of that is, if you're just doing a search and you don't know any better, especially if you're young, kid doing this is part of that shaping and learning that you're getting, and that's the cyberpsychology. And so the last thing I want to mention is a book, and it's not just a single book by this guy, Harari. This is one of the more recent ones from him. It's called Nexus. But he has a couple of really good books, and there's a couple of really good talks that you can find very easily on YouTube. He is not a cyber psychologist. He's not a psychologist. He's not a social scientist. He's more of a historian, kind of bordering on, philosopher type of thing. And as a historian, he really tells the story of civilization and how things develop. And, before digital technology, there was technology. There was other technologies, right? Inventing ways of creating a fire is technology. The fire is not technology, but creating it is, way, 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 way back. So, and if you can see like kind of like the subtitle here, I don't know if that's clear or not, right? It's like, he talks about a brief history of information networks from the Stone Age to AI. Tell me about cyber psychology right there, right? So, that's something that I hope to bring into the textbook as well, some of Harari's work, because the idea is the history of cyber psychology, history and systems, which is not a course I've ever seen We do have it at Norfolk State. I created it a couple of years ago. And so I want to build on that. And that becomes its own chapter in the textbook, really tracing where cyber psychology is. It didn't just start with MySpace research in the early 2000s, which is, you can see a lot of the journal articles back then focus on that and looking at, personality dimensions and are people more conceited these days? And it's like this, so much more now about it. People taking selfies is not just because they're self-centered, right? It's a whole cultural phenomenon. So the idea that, Harari is, the story that he's telling is not simply the end result. He's really connecting the dots across time and how things connect and how things progress. So, if you're going to spend some time reading or even just watching some stuff, on YouTube or something, I really recommend his stuff.
That's a really good point, because we forget there's a history, and we forget that we have evolved as a cultural species over time. And technology is not just about the digital stuff. It's about even going back to, as you say, fires and tools and implements and settling into farming
Yep.
based agriculture rather than being wanderers. And all those things are technology. And the difference is that it's
Mhm.
not digital. And that's the one shift. And it's still psychology. It's still about us as
Absolutely.
humans. And we forget
Mhm.
that. It's not, this is, yes, it's a new field
Mhm.
as such, but there's so much history that we forget about and we don't take into account. So that's
Yeah.
great recommendation. I'm going to have
Yeah,
to
yeah,
read his
I
book now
really love
too.
that, the Harari
Yeah.
stuff, and it is another through line to the Adlerian stuff, right? The social
Yeah.
connectivity and what your place in not just your macro system world, but kind of micro system, like the immediate people in your life and how you interact, kind of the uh, um, Yuri Bronfenbrenner and Vygotsky kind of like, zone of proximal development and,
Yes. Yes.
micro, exosphere and stuff like that. So it comes together with the social psych stuff. And, I'll mention one more thing, a little plug for Granya's stuff here
Yes.
in this textbook. I don't know if it's in any of her formal writing. It might be in one of those, like the Oxford Handbook of Cyberpsych, from, that gigantic book, which has a lot of great information. But she came to Norfolk State twice for in person to be the keynote at two different occasions. And one of the things that she had said always resonates with me to this day is that a lot of what's going on is, and this is a quote unquote from what she has said, is old wine in a new bottle. And
Yeah.
I kind of carry that message with me, like to this day, that, this cyber psychology, some of the theories, there might be new theories to be discovered about the overlap, the digital, and maybe even the future, the quantum, part of things. That might be another thing, but at its core, human behavior is human behavior. Um,
Exactly.
the systems around us might change and it influences how we behave. But, just taking that kind of purely cognitive model, the thoughts, feelings, and behaviors and how they interact with one another, that still gets us pretty far in terms of understanding, what people do and like why they do it, where they're coming from with it. So,
Yeah.
old wine in a new bottle.
Yeah, and that kind of goes back to what you were saying before about it's really about our place in this world. And all we're doing is using tools. And our digital stuff is just a tool
Just
that helps us
exactly.
understand that a bit more and kind of gets us.
Hmm.
We just see it from a slightly different perspective, but it's still the same stuff. We're
Yeah.
still dealing with the same stuff. We're still the same humans.
Just different tools. That's exactly what it
Yeah.
is. Just different tools. And tool could be used for something good and productive, or it can be used for something destructive. And, things like digital literacy are really important, especially not just for younger generations, but even older generations, understanding like that could be a tool to combat some of the misinformation, malinformation that's out there. But are we teaching kids, directly teaching kids about this, the importance of it? Is it part of K to 12 education so that it becomes, something firmly embedded in people, to be, critical consumers of information, not just
Yeah.
passive? And so, I hope to
Exactly.
weave a lot of that stuff into our textbook and, you know,
Awesome.
Yeah.
Well, Scott, thank you so much for joining me in Confessions of a Cyber Psychologist. It was so lovely to have you on board, and all the best with the writing of your book. I'm
Yeah.
looking forward to that coming out, and I hope I get to chat to you again and you get to come on and talk about more of your research and your results at a later
Absolutely.
stage.
I'd love to, and really appreciate you um, offering this avenue for me to reach the broader cyber psych community and anyone else who stumbles across it. Yeah, I think it's great. I think it's showcasing the different people and personalities in this field just springboards things even further in the right direction. So I appreciate what you're doing, and I appreciate you giving me some time to express what I'm doing.